We continue now at the top of Daf Tesam and Beis in Meseches Kiddushin. This is Kiddushin Daf 9b. The Gemara is continuing with the question of Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish is asking, when it comes to a shtar Kiddushin, does it need to be written Lishma? Do we compare it to a shtar for divorce, to a get, where we say Yitzia Be'inan Lishma, just like we say by a get, the Yitzia needs to be done Lishma, the Get Isha needs to be written Lishma. Af Havoya Be'inan Lishma, so too when it comes to the shtar Kiddushin, we require Lishma. Odilma, or maybe Havayos Lahadadi Makshinan. Maybe we're comparing the Havayos to one another, as the Gemara now explains. Mahavaya de Kesef, just like when it comes to the Havaya of Kesef, meaning when you have Kiddushin that's done with Kesef, so Lo Ba'inan Lishma, there is no requirement of Lishma in terms of the money. So Af Havaya de Shtar, so too when you have a Kiddushin of the Shtar, Lo Ba'inan Lishma, you don't require Lishma. And the Gemara says, Basar the Bai after Reish Lakish asked the question, Hadar Pasha, then he answered as follows: Havoya liyitzia makshinan. We do compare Havoya to Yitzia. The Yamar Krav v'yatza v'haisa. The pasuk says v'yatza v'haisa, and therefore the shtar kiddushin does need to be written lishma. And Rashi explains, Havoya de Kesef lo ba'inan shatei lishma. If you did kiddushin with Kesef, so the Kesef would not need to be created lishma. Shatei tzuras hadin or tvua lishma. For example, the image that's imprinted onto the coin wouldn't have to be put there lishma for the sake of the kiddushin. And then he answered that when it comes to shtar hadar pashta v'yatza v'haisa, that we do rely on v'yatza v'haisa. We compare the divorce to the marriage. Sharei ikar shashtar kona bi'isha mikan lamanu, because the main idea that a shtar acquires when it comes to marriage, that's learned out from the document of divorce, and so therefore it does require lishma. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Itmar, we have the following machlokas amoroim. Kasvu lishma v'shalom idaita. Let's say he writes the shtar kiddushin lishma, but he doesn't do it with her knowledge. Rava v'Ravina amri mikudeshes. Rava and Ravina say that it is a good kiddushin. Rav Papa v'Rav Sharvia amri eina mikudeshes. Rav Papa and Rav Sharvia, they say it is not a good kiddushin. Amar Rav Papa says, Eima taima didu, ve'eima taima didi. I'm going to say their reason, and I'll say my reason. Eima taima didu, let me say their reason as follows. Techsiv v'yatza v'haisa. It says in the pasuk, v'yatza v'haisa makish havaya liyitzia. Again, the kiddushin is compared to the divorce. Ma yitzia lishma v'shalom idaita. Just like when it comes to the divorce document, it has to be written for her sake, but it's not with her knowledge. So af havaya nami, so too when it comes to the shtar erisin, lishma v'shalom idaita, it's written for her sake, but it doesn't have to be with her knowledge. Ve'ema taima didi, and I'll say my reason. V'yatza v'haisa, we compare the divorce to the marriage. Makish havaya liyitzia, we compare the erisin to the divorce. Ma yitzia bo'inan das makna. Just like when it comes to the divorce, you do need the knowledge of the person who's being makna. In the case of divorce, the makna is the husband. He's being makna, the woman, the wife, to herself, so to speak, because she leaves him. So af havaya, so you can argue also by havaya when it comes to erisin, bo'inan das makna, we need the knowledge of the person who's being makna, and that would be the woman herself. She's being makna herself to the husband, giving herself over to the husband. Or if we're talking about a girl who's a minor, it would be the girl's father. Again, he's being makna her over to the husband. So maybe you can argue that's his reason. That's Rav Papa saying his own reason. His reason is that you require das makna, therefore you do require her das. And the Gemara continues, Meisvei, we have a question. This is from a Mishnah in Baba Basra. Ein kosven shtori erisin v'nisuin. We do not write documents of erisin or nisuin, elamidashneim, unless you have the das, unless you have the knowledge of both parties. And so the Gemara says, my lav, is it not talking about shtori erisin v'nisuin mamish? We're talking about actual documents of erisin and nisuin. And so you see that you do need her das. We need the das of both parties. And the Gemara says, lo, no, shtori psikasa. We're talking about shtori psikasa, which is the shtaros that are written in terms of the dowry, in terms of the monetary obligations that they're going to bring into the marriage. Uchid Rav Gidl amar Rav. It's like Rav Gidl says that Rav says, the Amar Rav Gidl amar Rav, because Rav Gidl says that Rav says, Kama ata nosen levincha. If he says, how much are you giving to your son going into this marriage? Kach v'kach, such and such. This is how much I'm giving. Lebitcha, how much are you giving to your daughter? What kind of dowry is she bringing? Kach v'kach, it's going to be such and such. Amdu v'kidru, if they get up and they have kiddushin, kanu, that creates the acquisition. Hein hadvarim haniknim bo amira. These are things which are acquired through speech. And Rashi says, Shtori psikasa, what are Shtori psikasa? Hatanoim shebeneim. Again, it's the conditions that they're making, the monetary conditions of the marriage. Umamon sheposkin zelazet, the money that they are promising to give one another in terms of the marriage. Bo amira, and so that's acquired, but amira meaning with speech, below kinyan, meaning you don't have to make a formal kinyan. Shah kiddushin hein gemar hadavar. The point over there is that the kiddushin, the act of kiddushin, that is the kinyan for these monetary obligations. Devahi anod dekomischat with that benefit that they have from becoming husband and wife, Gamri Omakni, it's through that they give over, that they make the kinyan. Uva osan hatanoim kamer. So it's with those conditions, that's what we're talking about. When we talk about the fact that you need das shnehem, you need the das of both parties, that's what we're talking about with those conditions. Sha'edim ein rashayin lichtov aleim shtar. The edim are not allowed to write a shtar about these monetary obligations, elami daitem, unless it's with the knowledge of both parties. Because maybe they prefer that it be a milval peh, that it be like an oral obligation, an oral loan, v'lo kamilva b'shtar, not something that's in a document. That's why you need the knowledge of both parties. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Ubabiyah, the third way of Kiddushin is with Biyah, with an act of relations. And the Gemara says, Menolan, from where do we know this? Where's the source that Biyah can be used for Kiddushin? Amr Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Avo says, that Rabbi Yochanan says, the Amar Kro, it's because the Pasuk says, Bu'ulas Baal. Context of the pasuk is ki motzei ish shochev im isha bu'ulas baal. If we find a man that's lying with a woman who's bu'ulas baal, who essentially means that she's a married woman, it's talking about adultery. It goes on to say the punishment for adultery. But melamed shenasa labal al yedei be'ila. Rabbi Yochanan says, you see from this pasuk that how did he become her husband? He became her husband through an act of be'ila, through an act of relations. That's how we see that an act of biyah can be an act of kiddushin. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Rabbi Zera le Rabbi Avo. Rabbi Zera said to Rabbi Avo, V'amri lo Reish Lakish le Rabbi Yochanan. Some say it's Reish Lakish that said to Rabbi Yochanan, why are you bringing this source of Bu'ulas Baal? Ku'ura zu Shashana Rebbe is the source that Rebbe brought. Is it unacceptable? Uva Allah, the pasuk says, Ki yikach ish isha uva Allah. It says a man takes a woman, uva Allah. Sounds like he has an act of relations, Melamed sheniknes b'biyah. Rebbe said, you see from this, it teaches us that she's acquired through biyah. So why are you bringing the pasuk of Bu'ulas Baal when you can instead bring the pasuk of uva Allah? And the Gemara says, Ime Hasan, if I only had it from there, if I only had that source, Hava Mina Ad Mekadesh V'Hadar Boil, I might think that what it means is that he has to be Mekadesh her with money and then have an act of relations, because the pasuk says, Ki Yikach Ish Isha, Ki Yikach Ish Isha, referring to the fact that he gives her money for Kiddushin, Uviola, and he has relations with her. So you would think you need both of them. So Kamash Malon, so that's why Rabbi Yochanan brings the pasuk of Bu'ulas Baal. Bu'ulas Baal teaches that the act of relations alone, that creates the Kiddushin. And the Gemara continues, Maskif lo Rabbi Abba bar Mamul. Rabbi Abba bar Mamul asks the following question. Imkein, if so, Nara Hamorasa. We have a case in the Torah of a Nara Hamorasa, that's a young girl who's betrothed, and again it's talking about a situation of adultery. The Amar Rachmana Beskila, the Torah says that in that case, the punishment over there is skila. So hechi mashkachas lana. How could you have a case of a nara hamorasa? Now the Gemara's question is referring to the fact that the nara hamorasa has to be a basula. She has to be a virgin. And so the Gemara now says, Ida aktish v'hadar boil. If the case over there is that there was a kiddushin and then there was an act of biyah. In other words, we're saying that Rabbi Yochanan held that you might have thought, when it says in the pasuk, Ki yikach ish isha uva Allah, it means to say there's kiddushin with money, followed by an act of biyah. But if that is the case, that you have a situation of kiddushin where money is given and then there has to be an act of relations, that's how we would have interpreted that pasuk. So ba'ulahi, so then she would be a ba'ula, meaning to say she would not be a basula, she would not be a virgin, and so you could never have the case of nara hamorasa. And ida aktish v'lo boil, if the case is that money was given for kiddushin without an act of biyah. So again, according to Rabbi Yochanan, if you only had the pasuk of uva Allah, so lav klumi, it would be nothing. So how could you ever have interpreted the pasuk of uva Allah to mean that you need money and an act of relations to have a kiddushin, but then you're never going to be able to explain the case of nara hamorasa? And the Gemara continues, Amru Rabbanan Kame de Abaya. The Rabbanan said before Abaya, Mashkachas no, we could find the case of Nara Hamorasa, even if you would have interpreted the pasuk of Uva Allah the way that Rabbi Yochanan explained. You could have a case of the case of Nara Hamorasa, Kegon Shaba Ale Oris Shalo Kedarka, because the act of the relations by the Erisin could be that the Oris came upon her Shalo Kedarka, not in the normal fashion, meaning to say it was anal. It was a situation where she remained the Basula, and that's how you can have a case where there was Ki Yikach Ish Isha Uva Allah, there was an act of relations in terms of Kiddushin, but she's still a Basula. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Abaya. Abaya said to him, Adkan lo pligi Rebbe v'Rabbanan, Ela bi'acher, how could you say that? The entire machlokas between Rebbe and the Rabbanan is only if someone else has relations with her, so then there's a machlokas, is she considered, if it's shalo kedarka, is she considered a basula or not? Avol bal, but when it comes to the husband himself, divrei hakol, everybody agrees, in baal shalo kedarka, that if he has relations with her and it's shalo kedarka, asa ba'ula, she's considered to be a ba'ula, she's not a basula. So that would not be a sufficient answer. To answer that the nara hamorasa is talking about a situation of bia shalo kedarka would not actually explain a nara hamorasa. And the Gemara says, Mahi, what is this machlokas Rebbe and the Rabbanan you're referring to? The Gemara just referenced the machlokas between Rebbe and the Rabbanan by Bia Shalo Kedarka, is she a Besula or Be'ula? That's from the following Brisa. The Tanya, as we learned in a Brisa, Bo Allah Yud Anoshim, let's say she has relations with 10 men. V'yadayin hi Besula, but those acts of relations, they were all Shalo Kedarka, and she's still a Besula. So we have a machlokas Tanoim, Kulan Beskila. The first opinion, the Rabbanan say that they all get Skila. Why do they all get Skila? Because she's considered a Besula. It's considered a case of Nar Hamorasa. But Rebbe says, Omer Ani I say Harishon Beskila. The first one gets Skila, because at that point in time she was in fact a Besula. V'kulan Bechenek, but everyone else gets Chenek, because Bia Shalo Kedarka does render her not a Besula. And so in any case, we're back to our question. According to Rabbi Yochanan, how else could you have interpreted the pasuk of Uva Allah? Because if you'd interpret the pasuk of Ki yikach ish isha Uva Allah as being kesef and an act of relations, you would never be able to explain the case of Nara HaMorasa. And the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says, Mashkachas lo, you could find the case of Nara HaMorasa. He gives a simple answer, Kagon shekid shebishtar. For example, the Kiddushin was done with a shtar, with a document. In that case, she still is a Besula, because by a shtar there's no requirement for an act of Bia. Even with the interpretation Rabbi Yochanan would have given to the pasuk of Ki yikach ish isha, that you need kesef and also an act of Bia, that's only by kesef. But shtar alone could be a Kiddushin. Why would we say that? Hoel v'gomer umotzi, gomer umachnas. Because since a shtar is able to fully divorce her, it's also able to fully bring her into the marriage, and therefore that's what you would have said, and that's why Rabbi Yochanan brings the additional pasuk of Be'ulas Baal. That becomes the source that an act of relations can be a Kiddushin. And the Gemara continues, Rabbi Yochanan hayu uva'olah ma'avidle. Now Rabbi Yochanan, what does he do with the word uva'olah? If he learns out the idea that an act of relations is Kiddushin from Be'ulas Baal, what does he do with Ki yikach ish isha uva'olah? And the Gemara says to that, Hahumi boile zu niknas bebia, ve'ein amahoivriya niknas bebia. He uses that pasuk of uva'olah to say that in this case, meaning in a case of marriage, so an act of relations can be a Kiddushin. But if a person is acquiring an amahoivriya, he's acquiring a Hebrew maidservant, she is not acquired through Bia, she's not acquired through an act of relations. And the Gemara continues, because I might have thought that we should learn a kal v'chomer from Yavama, that an act of relations does work by an amohavriya. Because what do we find by Yavama, where kesef does not create the kinyan, but Bia does create the kinyan? So in this case of an amohavriya, sheniknas bekesef, who is acquired with money, eino din sheniknas bebia, isn't it logical that she should be acquired with an act of relations? And so therefore I would have learned that from Yavama, and that's why I need the pasuk of Uva Allah, according to Rabbi Yochanan. The pasuk of Uva Allah tells us that an Amma Ha'ivriya is in fact not acquired through Bia. But the Gemara says, how could you have ever learned from Yavama? Ma'ali Yavama shekein zakuka v'omedis. What's unique about Yavama is that she's already bound. She's bound to the Yavam once her husband dies, and so therefore it makes sense over there that an act of relations should work. Why would we then say that an act of relations should work by an Amma Ha'ivriya? But the Gemara says, Salka daitach amina, no, I might have thought, Hoel v'kasav imacheres yikachlo, since the pasuk says, if he takes, talking about the owner of the Amma Ivriya, if he takes for himself another wife, so he kisha hakasav lacheres, I might have thought there's a comparison here between the Amma Ivriya and the other wife that the master takes. Ma'acheres mikniya bebia, af Amma Ivriya mikniya bebia, I might have thought, just like the other wife is acquired through Bia, so too the Amma Ivriya is acquired through Bia. And again, Kamash Malon, that's what this pasuk of Uva Allah teaches us, that an Amma Ha'ivriya is not acquired through an act of Bia. And the Gemara continues, V'Rebbe, now according to Rebbe, who learns out that Bia works for Kiddushin, so Hai Svarim and Nali, so where does he learn this idea? Meaning Rabbi Yochanan uses Uva Allah to say that an Amma Ha'ivriya is not acquired through Bia. How does Rebbe know that? And the Gemara says to that, Imkain, if so, Lichtov Rachmanu Uval. The pasuk could have just said Uval. My Uva Allah, why does it say Uva Allah? That extra letter in the word, Shema Mino Tarti, you actually see from there two things. First, you see, like Rebbe said before, you see that an act of relations is considered an act of Kiddushin. And furthermore, you also see this halacha, that again, an Amma Hevriya is not acquired through Bia. But the Gemara continues, Ula but according to Rava, the Amar who says, Barahino asabrali, that Barahina explained to me, Ki yikach ish isha uva Allah. When the pasuk says Kiikach ish isha uva'ala, what does that teach us? It teaches us Kiddushin hamisurin libia have a Kiddushin, that if you have a Kiddushin which could lead to an act of relations, that's a good Kiddushin. But Kiddushin she'ein misurin libia, but a Kiddushin that cannot be given over to bia, lo have a Kiddushin, so it's not considered to be a good Kiddushin. And so the point over here is that according to Rava, this pasuk of uva'ala is already used for this concept of Kiddushin hamisurin libia. And so then if that's the case, where does he learn the idea? Where does Rava learn out the idea that an Amo Hevriya cannot be acquired through Bia? Ma'ikal Meimer, what are you going to say again according to Rava? And the Gemara says to that, Imkein nichtov kra o ba'ala. If so, the pasuk could have said o ba'ala, my uva'ala. What does the pasuk mean when it says uba'ala? Shma mina. So you see from here, Shma mina kulu. You see all of these different halachas. Again, you see the halacha that an Amo Hevriya cannot be acquired through Bia. You see the halacha also that when it comes to Kiddushin, it has to be Kiddushin hamisurin labia. And finally, you see within Rebbe, you see the halacha that an act of Bia can be an act of Kiddushin. And Rashi explains, Ulu Rava da Amar lekamon beperek sheni. According to Rava, who says later in the second parak, Ave mekadesh achas mishtei achios. The case over there is the person has Kiddushin with one of two sisters, stam lo have a Kiddushin. So then it's not considered a good Kiddushin. Hoel ve'ein ru'uyin lebia, because in that case, that Kiddushin can't lead to an act of Bia. She'eno yodea ezo ishto ve'ezo achos ishto. The point over there is that he doesn't know which one of the sisters is his wife and which one is the sister of his wife. She bekares, the sister of his wife would be punishable by kares. V'yamar Rav, and Rav said on that, Barahina asabrali, Barahina explained to me, Chacham echad sheshmo Barahina, meaning there was a certain wise person whose name was Barahina, limadni tam zemin amikra, he taught me the reason for this from the pasuk. Ki yikach uva'ala, because it says ki yikach uva'ala, kichas kesef haru'uya lebe'ila. It has to be a Kiddushin of kesef, which could be fit for an act of Bia. Hu da have a kicha, only that is an act of, only that is kicha, only that is considered Kiddushin. So now, according to Rava, we're learning out from Uva'ala two other things. We're learning out the halacha of Rebbe again, that Bia is considered Kiddushin, and we're also learning out that Bia cannot be used by Amo Hevriya. So where's Rava going to find those halachas if he uses it for this other halacha that it has to be Mesur and Labia? And the Gemara said, Im kain de l'kiddushay bia. If so, de l'kiddushay bia v'lemutei amma v'sulo. If the only things the pasuk was teaching us was the fact that bia can be kiddushin, and to exclude an amma ha'ivriya from a kinyan of bia, and the v'sulo yalef minan, you don't learn anything else. So lichtov o ba'ala, could have said o ba'ala, my u ba'ala. Why does it say u ba'ala? Mashma de koi nami akicha. The vav connects it to the kiikach lemelaf hach the barahina, and that's where barahina is learning out the idea that it has to be a kiddushin that is Mesurin Labia. And the Gemara continues, V'Rebbe, now according to Rebbe, who learns that Bia is considered Kiddushin from the pasuk of Uva'ala, Hai Be'ulas Baal Ma'avidle, what does he do with the pasuk of Be'ulas Baal? That pasuk of Be'ulas Baal, Rabbi Yochanan used to say that an act of Bia creates a Kiddushin. What does Rebbe do with Be'ulas Baal? And the Gemara says to that, Hai Mi Boi Le, that pasuk is needed for the following halacha according to Rebbe, Baal Osa Be'ula Shalo Kedarka. In a case of a husband, if the husband has an act of relations with her Shalo Kedarka, then she's considered to be a Be'ula. She's not considered to be a basula virgin. Vein acher, but nobody else. Also, sabula shalo kedarka. Let's say anyone else who's not her husband has relations with her, and it's relation shalo kedarka. So that does not make her beula. Rather, she's still considered to be a basula. But the Gemara says, how could you say that? Umi islay l'Rebbe hai svara. But does Rebbe even hold like that? As Rashi over here says, hai svara dein acher osa be'ula shelo kedarka. Does Rebbe really say that other people don't render her a be'ula when they have an active relation shelo kedarka? That's not true. Vatanya, but we learned in a brisa, this is the brisa we brought above. Bo aleh yud anoshim, if 10 men have an active relations with her, v'yadayin hi besulin, she's still a besula, meaning they have relations with her shelo kedarka. This again is talking about the case of adultery by a nara Rasa, Kulam Beskila. So according to the Rabbanan, they all get skila because she's considered a besula. But Rebbe doesn't say that. Rebbe says, Omer Ani, I say, Harishon Beskila. The first one gets skila because at that point in time she's still a besula. V'kulam bechenek, but all the rest of them get the punishment of chenek, the punishment of strangulation, not the punishment of stoning, because apparently according to Rebbe, not only the husband, but anyone who has relations with her and it's shelo kedarka, she is going to be considered a be'ula. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Amud Aleph.